Thank you all for coming today for this really excellent lecture. Our presenter today is Professor Jessica Barnes, whose work examines the cultural, political, and material dimensions of resource use and environmental change in the Middle East and beyond. She has published several books, including Cultivating the Nile, The Everyday Politics of Water in Egypt, with Duke University Press 2014, Climate Cultures, Anthropological Perspectives on Climate Change, co-edited with Michael Dove, Yale University Press in 2015, and Staple Security, Bread and Wheat in Egypt, Duke University Press 2022, as well as a number of journal articles. Her research has been supported by grants from the American Council of Learned Societies, Winner Grant Foundation, and the National Science Foundation. Jessica received her PhD in Sustainable Development from Columbia University and is currently an associate professor in the Department of Geography at the University of South Carolina. Please join me in welcoming our speaker. So excited to hear about your work on Egypt. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Shalabi, for that lovely introduction. And I'm just delighted to be here with you all. Thank you for the invitation to come and give a talk. Really looking forward to sharing some of this work with you and to our discussion. So when Egyptian protesters took to the streets in January 2011, they called for bread, freedom, and social justice. العيش, الحرية, العدالة الاجتماعية. Bread here was in part symbolic, a reference to livelihoods, to people's frustrations at their inability to build decent lives for themselves. But it was also literal. Some protesters carried loaves in their hands or fashioned helmets out of bread. They were calling for bread because bread is a food that most Egyptians eat every day, 3 times a day. They were calling for bread because the years prior had seen severe shortages in the supply and quality of the very widely eaten government-subsidized bread. And to the protesters, these deficiencies were really emblematic of the Mubarak regime's shortcomings. Now, as a staple food, bread is fundamentally tied to the staple crop from which it's made, wheat. Egyptians grow a lot of wheat, mostly on very small-scale farms, just a couple of acres or so in size. But Egyptian farmers don't grow enough to meet the country's very high demand for bread, so about half their wheat is imported. To Egyptians, the possibility that their nation could run out of wheat or that they might not have enough decent bread to eat is an existential threat. It's a threat to the well-being of Egypt's poor, for whom cheap bread constitutes a major portion of their caloric intake, and it's a threat to the stability of the state. History has shown how people don't sit idly by when they don't have good bread to eat. In my book, I introduce the concept of staple security to describe the practices through which people seek to counter this threat and ensure the continuous supply of a quality staple, both at the national level and then at the level of the individual households. Just to take each part of this concept in turn, by staple, what I mean is a food that defines a meal. A staple is a food that if it's not on the table, people don't feel like they've properly eaten. I remember back in 2008, which was a time when there were severe bread shortages, I talked with one man who told me how he'd been to the bakery that morning and he hadn't been able to get any bread. There was none left. And he said to me, "I couldn't bring bread for my children today. They won't have anything to eat." By this, he didn't mean literally that his children wouldn't eat anything all day, rather that without bread, they wouldn't be properly nourished. As one of my Egyptian friends once commented to me, it's impossible to last a day without bread. Bread is something fundamental. And just as an aside, I don't think this is something, the sort of Egyptian peculiarity. There might be people on the call who have lived or worked in other parts of the Middle East. And I think this sort of sensibility, these sentiments will be familiar to those who work in other parts of the Middle East or from other parts of the Middle East. And I think we can also see a number of parallels with other staples in other parts of the world. So you might think, for example, about rice in East Asia, for example. So what staple security does is it brings together this particular kind of food with this notion of security, an idea that political scientists have long thought about and theorized, but which recently has been taken up much more broadly by anthropologists and geographers. And what this work has done is expanded conceptualizations of security beyond the kind of things we might commonly think about, things like policing borders or maintaining stability, to really consider how security infuses daily life. So we have here this definition from Gluck and Lowe, where they define security as a modality of constructing danger, enemies, fear, and anxiety, and the measures taken to guard against such constructed threats. What I liked about this definition is that it points to these two dimensions to security. On the one hand, you have this affective dimension, the lived experience of fear and risk. And then on the other hand, you have the actions that people are taking to address those perceived threats. And obviously, these two dimensions are interlinked. So actions may lead to a momentary state of security in which those feelings of anxiety give way to feelings of reassurance or comfort, but that threat is ever present. I introduced this idea of staple security as a deliberate point of departure from the concept of food security. And this is because I see food security as being anchored in a particular history of international conferences, negotiated definitions like this one, which is quite old now, but is still very commonly cited, and kind of policy approaches. And one of the things I found very striking about this work, is that despite the inclusion of the word security within the term, explorations of security itself have been remarkably absent. So food security tells us little about how the anxieties that might surround efforts to obtain particular foods, or what might happen in its absence. So this sort of bland definition about people being able to access food stands in stark contrast with that square in downtown Cairo thronging with protesters. Food security also isn't very helpful for thinking about staples specifically. As you can see from this definition, nutritional balance is now a key part of how policy scholars think about food security. You can't be food secure just by eating bread. And this was really brought home to me during my research, where I found that all the people I talked to who were working on food security never mentioned bread, except to sometimes say that they thought that Egyptians ate too much bread. And all the people working on bread and wheat issues never framed their work in terms of food security. So there's this sort of disconnect between how people experience security related to a particular food and how policy scholars think about food security. Staple security, therefore, enables me to kind of move beyond work on food security to think about this nexus between food and security. It focuses attention on staple foods because these foods are unlike others in their existential importance to people's daily lives and to the legitimacy of the state. This is why their substandard quality or their absence poses such a threat. Now, of course, it's possible to live without bread, but as we all know, security isn't really about the assessment of real dangers. It's an imaginary. The affective dimension of staple security therefore captures both a political leader's fear of the bread riot and that unsettled feeling a parent has when there's no bread left in the home. It also captures other forms of affect, the pleasure of eating a meal with freshly baked bread, or the yearning for bread that tastes of rural childhoods. In other words, people care what this bread tastes like. The other dimension of staple security is the concrete actions through which people seek to secure the presence of a palatable staple. These range from the government's operation of a huge food subsidy program to small individual acts within the home, like handling leftover loaves at the end of a meal. My book draws on ethnographic research that I've conducted since 2007 in rural Egypt in a village that I call Warda, which is in Fayoum province, just a couple of hours southwest of Cairo, as well as interviews, archival research, and analysis of Arabic language newspapers. It also draws on ethnographic research that I did in collaboration with an Egyptian research assistant, Miriam Tahar, at bakeries in Cairo from 2015 through 2017. So what I want to do in my talk today is to give you 3 examples to illustrate this idea of staple security. In each example, we see the relationship between the wheat, bread, and the body, but the nature of the body shifts across them, from the body of the Egyptian nation to the body of a household to the body of an individual. My first case is about the Egyptian government's procurement of foreign wheat. The second is about accessing government subsidized bread in Cairo. And the third is about maintaining the quality of homemade bread in a rural household. The language of security is very explicit at the national level, but it fades as we move down to the household. Yet the underlying rationale remains. Individuals are just as concerned about the supply of good bread as the state is. So while these actions that I'm going to talk to you about seem quite different on the face of it, they're each in their own ways part of the effort to ensure that Egyptians have good bread to eat every day. I bring together these scales and sites because it's through everyday practices taking place in fields, silos, bakeries, and within the home that the feeling of security reaches the bellies of the Egyptian people. So my first example is about the procurement of foreign wheat. As I said before, Egypt relies on imports for about half its needs, and this makes Egypt one of the largest importers of wheat in the world. About half this imported wheat is purchased by the government by an agency known as GASC for use in the production of subsidized bread, and the remainder is imported by the private sector for use in some kind of specialty goods, cakes and pasta and things like that. I'll talk more about this subsidized bread shortly, but basically the government has been subsidizing one particular kind of bread, which is known commonly as baladi bread, since the 1940s. While the government also buys a lot of wheat from Egyptian farmers, without imported wheat, there wouldn't be enough flour to bake the subsidized bread for the 70 million or so people who eat it every single day. Egyptians are very well aware of their nation's reliance on imported wheat, and it's something that they worry about. One day I was chatting with a woman called Layla in her home in Warda. Layla's in her 20s, smart and curious. We were talking about baking bread and farming wheat, elements of Layla's day-to-day experience. I was slightly surprised when, without any prompting, she said to me, "You know, Egypt has to import wheat." It was very clear from her tone that she didn't see this as being a good thing. She went on to suggest that Egypt should reclaim more desert land and use it for growing wheat. Then, she said, we'd produce enough wheat for ourselves. That Layla would mention this to me is revealing. She often talks about things going on in the news, but her world is far removed from that of grain policy making in Cairo. In fact, she's never been to Cairo. Still, she has an opinion on the policy decisions being made there. It matters to her that Egypt isn't self-reliant. To her, it's a marker of national weakness. We see similar perspectives in newspaper commentaries, this sense that relying on others for your food means you don't own your freedom, or the fear that comes from being subject to the whims of others to send you wheat. This concern is what might happen if Egypt couldn't get the wheat that it needs from overseas, if prices went up, or if the government didn't have enough money, or if politics influenced trade flows, all of which are things that have actually happened over the last couple of years with the war in Ukraine. And we can talk more about this in the Q&A if people are interested in discussing it more. The sense of vulnerability, though, comes not just from the possibility that the wheat supply could be interrupted, but also because of concerns about the quality of imported wheat. Fears about bad wheat from overseas abound. One newspaper article referred to shipments arriving at Egyptian ports as carrying what are really the worst kinds of wheat in the world, only fit for animals. And just to be sure, just to be clear, so none of this imported wheat is being used for animal feed. It's all being used for feeding people in their daily bread. In an interview with two Cairo-based food activists, they asked me if I'd heard about the scandal surrounding Russian wheat. Bad wheat from Russia, they said. They couldn't actually really remember any of the details. They thought it had something to do with carcinogens, but they were very clear in their minds with this association of Russian wheat with danger. But the government doesn't just let any old wheat into the country. It sets regulations and it has a whole inspection process for ensuring that the imported wheat meets them. Still, there's a politics to what exactly comprises those regulations and how they're enforced. This is part of what staple security is at the national level. It's about mediating how much and what kind of wheat enters Egypt, both of which impact how much and what kind of bread the state is able to subsidise. To illustrate this, I want to tell you about a controversy in recent years over a fungus called ergot. We might not commonly think about a fungus that's found on grain as a threat to national security, but actually that's just how the Egyptian government saw it. In 2015, towards the end of the year, Egyptian inspectors turned away a 63,000-ton shipment of French wheat from the port of Damietta, sending shockwaves through the global wheat industry. The wheat had been purchased by Gask from Bunge, one of the world's largest grain trading companies. And the reason for the rejection was the wheat's contamination with ergot. Ergot is quite a common fungus found on grain around the world, but it's highly toxic to both humans and animals and can cause severe health problems, even death. According to the Codex Alimentarius, which is a set of internationally adopted food safety guidelines, 0.05% is this key threshold. This is the maximum level of ergot contamination that's deemed not to pose a health risk. And this is the standard, for example, that they use in the US. But in rejecting the French shipment, the Egyptian inspectors were calling instead for a more stringent zero tolerance. They did this in part because a number of Egyptian officials are worried about imported grain carrying ergot and what would happen if it came in and contaminated Egyptian fields, which don't at the moment have any problem with fungus. This could jeopardize domestic wheat cultivation because the fungus reduces grain yields and thereby affect the supply of flour for bread production. Officials are also concerned about the impact on human health. One member of parliament described ergot contamination as a national security issue because, she said, it affects the health of a large number of citizens and can lead to permanent disability or death. A number of commentators also drew on the high consumption of bread by Egyptians to support this move towards zero tolerance. One agricultural professor, for example, drew a comparison between the Egyptian citizen who eats 182 kilograms of bread a year and the European citizen who consumes only 60 kilograms, concluding that what Egyptians are liable to a very dangerous rate of damage, just not comparable to that faced by others. But the government was in a tricky situation since it has to get wheat from somewhere, and ergot is so common in many of the major wheat exporting countries. It's found in the United States, for example. Government officials went back and forth with different experts weighing in on the risks, and in the end they decided to reverse their stance, not because they concluded that ergot didn't pose a safety concern, but because traders said that they wouldn't sell wheat to Egypt if the government insisted on zero tolerance. Such an expectation, they just claimed, was unreasonable. As one European trader said, no country anywhere in the world can provide wheat with zero ergot in bulk volume. When I talked about this case with a grain trading expert, he explained that the government decided to conform with the international standard because otherwise, he said, it would, quote, make problems with the supply. So the government is always juggling its concerns about the quality of imported wheat with the imperative to maintain a continual supply of flour for the subsidized bread program. When that supply is threatened, the government sometimes has to compromise on quality. In 2018, ergot returned to the news when officials found that a shipment of Russian wheat contained 0.06% ergot, just above the limit, and they rejected it. Russia responded with a swift denial and sent a delegation to Egypt. Following further testing of samples in Cairo, officials revised their claims, announcing that the levels were within accepted limits and releasing the wheat into the country. This struck me as curious. Was the change in decision actually related to new testing results or pressure exerted by the Russian delegation? Or could it have been driven by the government's need for wheat at that particular point in time? When I interviewed a grain trading expert later that year, I asked him why the government had changed its mind on this Russian shipment. He smiled and corrected me. They didn't change their mind, he said. They retested it. He spoke with conviction, but his following statement undermined the apparent neutrality of this testing process. The problem is, he said, that some inspectors are stricter. So in this first example, we see this sense of threat, a threat that Egypt might not have enough wheat for its subsidized bread program, or that some of the wheat being turned into flour and baked into loaves could be contaminated. And these are threats that are talked about explicitly in terms of national security. And we also see the response, a wrangling over import regulations between government officials, agricultural experts, grain traders, and inspectors who all have slightly different interests. This is an example of what staple security looks like at the national level. My next two examples take us down to the household and to what is ultimately at stake: bread. So my second case is about the government subsidized bread, which is known as baladi bread and is eaten by most Egyptians on a daily basis. This is a pita-style bread made with a dark brown rich flour produced from a mix of imported wheat and domestic wheat. It's produced largely in privately owned small-scale bakeries, a bit like this one. And for people with ration cards, it costs less than 5 piastres a loaf. That's less than a fifth of a US cent, a fraction of the cost of production, and about a 20th of the price of other breads in the market. The government hasn't raised this price for decades. And this is actually a notable point of contrast with other subsidies like those on fuel, which the government has been rolling back under pressure from international financial institutions. In the past, there have been moments of severe shortages in the supply of this bread, of baladi bread, like in 2007 and 2008 during the global food crisis. People were having to wait in long lines at bakeries, sometimes as much as 2 or 3 hours, sometimes getting to the front of the line and finding that all the bread had gone. There were a number of cases of fights breaking out at bakeries, leading to people being killed. And this was a source of great public anger. As a result, after the revolution, the governments of first President Morsi and then President Sisi sought to reform the subsidy program to address this question of bread shortages. In 2014, the government sort of changed the whole way that this subsidy program operates. And there were a number of different dimensions to this reforms, which I can talk about later if of interest. But in short, they were quite successful. Today, it's rare for bakeries to run out of bread, and no longer do you find long lines. And many people say that the bread tastes better. The reform I want to focus on, though, is the introduction of an electronic smart card to mediate access to this bread. Before this time, anyone, including someone like me, could go up to a bakery and buy bread for the subsidized price. But since 2014, to get a loaf of bread for 5 piastres, you have to have one of these cards, which proves your eligibility. Economists might refer to this shift, this is a shift from a universal to a targeted subsidy, but actually the eligibility criteria are sufficiently broad that the vast majority of Egyptians, maybe 70% or so of the population, so not just the very poor, are still entitled to this bread. To get baladi bread these days, and what you do is you pay in cash, and at the same time you hand over your smart card, which the bakery staff insert in one of these card readers. The card reader logs how many loaves you're buying and keeps track of your allocation. So each person is entitled to 5 loaves a day. If you have a household of 6, you can get 30. And if you don't want that much bread, you can exchange any unused bread points for other subsidized goods, things like sugar, tea, rice. Some bakeries will still sell you bread if you don't have a smart card, but instead of paying 5 piastres, you have to pay closer to the cost of production. So that might be 50 piastres or perhaps even more. Or if you don't have a smart card, you can go to a different kind of bakery and buy a non-subsidized bread, which normally costs around £1 Egyptian pound a loaf, although actually all these prices have gone up significantly. These non-subsidized prices have gone up significantly over recent years. So the smart card has become the means of accessing cheap bread. And to get one of these smart cards requires a particular kind of laboring with the bureaucracy, standing in lines not at the bakery, but at various government offices. Once you have a smart card, you have to do certain things to make sure that the smart card keeps working. And I see these efforts at accessing and maintaining smart card as everyday practices of staple security on the individual level. They too are ways of people making sure that they have cheap bread to eat. I want to now tell you a story about a woman who I call Faiza and her card. This is a story about bureaucracy. It's a story that might feel familiar to some of you who spent a long, frustrating day at the DMV. But in telling you this long and frustrating story, I want to offer a glimpse into what it's like to live in a world where access to a food that you rely on for 3 meals a day is mediated by bureaucratic lines and paperwork. Faiza is a widow in her 60s who lives with her 3 adult children, granddaughter, and sister in a small 2-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood of Cairo. This is her local market street. She's someone my research assistant, Miriam, has known since her childhood. Faiza has a small pension from her deceased husband and does some occasional cooking or cleaning work, or childcare work, but no one in her household has permanent full-time job. Sometimes she buys non-subsidized kinds of bread, which some members of her family prefer, but mostly she relies on baladi bread. Early in 2016, Faiza becomes sick. This was right in the middle of my collaborative fieldwork with Miriam. Unable to leave her apartment, Faiza doesn't use her smart card for several weeks. When her health improves, she goes to the bakery to get bread, only to find that her card has been deactivated. Over the following months, Faiza goes through the steps of trying to reactivate or get a new card several times. Each time she tells Miriam about the hours she has spent in bureaucratic offices, filling out forms, paying fees, and submitting paperwork. We keep a log in our field notes of the attempts, as well as their lack of success. Faiza complains, "They keep sending me to different places, different offices. No one takes responsibility." As an elderly person who finds it difficult to move about, she finds these busy offices challenging places to be. "I'm an old woman. Why do they have to make me run all around just to get bread?" By the time Miriam finishes her fieldwork in 2017, Faiza still hasn't got a card. She continues having to buy bread at a much higher price or to rely on subsidized loaves that her friends sometimes give her if they have extra. While the problem was precipitated by her not using the card for a few weeks, her sense of vulnerability without it is palpable. She has enough money to occasionally afford non-subsidized bread, but it makes a difference when she can't get subsidized goods for months on end. Prices of most things in the market have been really rocketing up. There's been huge inflation since the government devalued the currency in 2017, and more prices increases recently with the war in Ukraine and the COVID pandemic. In this context, cheap bread provides a crucial safety net. In September 2018, when Miriam returns to Egypt after some time overseas, she offers to accompany Faiza to the local offices of the Ministry of Supply, which is the government agency that manages the card program, the subsidy program. When they arrive just after 9 a.m., the office isn't yet open, but there are little groups of people everywhere. The women have organized themselves into an order, taking names in a numbered list. Faiza is 41st on the women's list. Around 9:30, the metal shutters are pulled up and the service windows appear. Immediately, the crowds swarm. There's constant activity at the windows, women waving folders, plastic folders, papers, and cards, shouting and pushing, but little movement in the line. An hour later, number 20 has moved less than a few feet forwards. Suddenly, 2 new windows open, and Miriam and Faiza make their way over through the crowds. But when they talk to the clerk, he tells Faiza that all her information has gone from the system and she has to do the paperwork again. He gives her a list of instructions and sends her off to other offices in search to get more documentation. They set off around Cairo, following these instructions in search of paper. At the second office they go to, Faiza is told that she doesn't actually need these documents and given another set of instructions completely different to the first. 4 hours, 3 offices, 3 taxi rides, many lines later, and still no card. A week later, they try again, this time going to another local branch of the Ministry of Supply where they think that there might be fewer people. When they arrive just before 9, it's less crowded than the other office was. Faiza is number 11 on the list. They stand in line, occasionally moving forwards, most of the time immobile. When they get to the front and explain their situation, the clerk tells them that Faiza needs a form at the next window, and they move to the back of that window's line. It's now 9:55 and getting hot. Bodies are pressing in on all sides, pouncing at any opportunity to move forwards. Around Miriam, everyone is asking questions, unsure of the process. Is this where I get a form? Are you applying for a card as well? Nuggets of information circulate through the crowd, collected eagerly by those who are waiting as they seek to piece together how exactly the system works. Eventually, they get to the front. The clerk starts going through Faiza's papers, but notices a problem. She needs to file a report with the police station to get proof that she no longer has a card. Determined to make progress, they decide to go to a police office nearby to get this done and then return to the office to stand in line again. When it's Faiza's turn, she presents her papers once more. The woman goes through them, fills out a form, and staples everything together. She tells them that they have to take these papers to another window. I warned you, this was quite a long story. They join a line at yet another window, but it's not moving. It turns out that the computer system is down. One woman in the line, who's also waiting for a new card, confides that she feels lucky. Her husband knows the owner of a bakery, and he lets them take 10 loaves a day. If she had to wait for her card before she could get subsidized bread, she wouldn't be able to manage. This food is key to her household security. After a while, the system begins working and the lines start edging forward. At last, it's Faiza's turn and she hands it over her paperwork. The clerk glances through her documents and tells her, apologetically, that she's at the wrong office. She has to go to the office that she's zoned for. Tired and fed up, Faiza and Miriam decide to go that day to finish the process. They return to the same office they went to on the previous occasion, which is calmer on this day, with only 20 or so people lining up outside. At the window, the clerk flicks through Faiza's documents, stamps some papers, and says that the process is complete. She'll receive a text message when her card is ready. It could take 15 days or up to 3 months. 9 months later, Faiza finally receives her card. But she never receives the PIN number that she needs to activate it, which is meant to be delivered by text message. After multiple trips to offices to ask, she finds out that the number on record for her is out of date. She has to go to a mobile phone store and buy a SIM card for her old phone number, but isn't sure what to do next. When Miriam returns to Cairo for a visit in September 2019, she offers to put money on Faiza's phone so that they can try sending a text message to receive the PIN. Miriam types in the number, but is unable to send an empty message as required because on Faiza's phone, the message to send, the button to send the message only comes up when you type something into the composition box. Eventually, frustrated, Miriam types in "Rakam sirri fan," where is the PIN number, and presses send. Several minutes later, to both their surprise, the phone buzzes. The screen shows a 4-digit code and the notification that Faiza's card will be operational by October the 4th at the latest. Sure enough, in early October, Faiza's card starts working and the nearly 4-year saga comes to an end. Faiza's story isn't unique. This was actually a whole tent that was set up in Cairo in March 2019 for people whose cards had been stopped for a number of reasons who wanted to lodge a complaint. Faiza talks about her friend, who's a widow with 2 disabled children, who's been waiting to receive a new card for a year and can barely get by in the meantime. She describes another woman who lives with her husband and 4 children in the small space under the stairs of the apartment building where he works as a doorman. They've been waiting 2 years for a card. Both this woman and her husband are illiterate and struggle with navigating the government bureaucracy. Faiza talks about another old man she met one day at the Ministry of Supply office who was dizzy and tired. He had submitted all his paperwork, made multiple payments, been told numerous times that his card was on its way, but had been waiting for 6 months. Everyone has a story, says Faiza, a long, sad story. It's all difficult. The line has shifted from the highly politicized and much photographed space of the bakery to the less visible and more sparsely media coverage space of the bureaucratic office. In the process, opaque bureaucratic procedures have created a new set of barriers to bread access that work to disadvantage those with low levels of literacy, who are unfamiliar with using online systems, or who don't have the time or physical strength to spend hours at busy government offices. While the bread line is a clear symbol of systemic failure and individual humiliation, in offices and mobile phone networks, these conditions are less tangible, but still present. For an elderly person like Faiza, or for the almost 1/3 of the adult population who's illiterate, an inability to navigate the system brings not only frustration, but a sense of shame. What Pfizer's story illustrates is that even when a government spends so much money procuring good quality wheat and subsidizing a staple such that its price is sufficiently low as to be affordable to all, its bureaucratic procedures may impede access. Getting bread for a family, therefore, can require very many different forms of practice. Dealing with paperwork may be just as important as going to a bakery. My final example of staple security takes us within the home and shifts from an urban to a rural context to look at people who also eat bread every day, but don't have to wait in long lines to do so because they bake it themselves. In this example, people aren't explicitly invoking security, yet that is the affective orientation underpinning their labors. In this example, we see how this nexus of food and security is also found in everyday practices of handling food within the home. In Warda, the village where I've been conducting research since 2007, many households bake their own bread from homegrown wheat. In this area, they make these large, round, flat loaves. In other parts of the country, they make different kinds of bread. Through the production of homemade bread, farming households consume about 60% of the domestic wheat harvest. So this is all wheat that doesn't enter into circulation to be used in the subsidized bread program. Baking bread takes a lot of time, and there's a whole other story I could tell about how women find the flour and labor necessary to produce their own bread. This isn't something that they do every day. You know, women will typically bake large amounts of bread at one time, perhaps 50 kilograms of flour at a time. So instead of looking at this occasional labor of baking, I want to focus on the daily labor of managing bread within the home. These tasks may be small, but I'd argue that they're key to ensuring that people in these rural households have a satisfactory staple to eat. And just as a side note, this is a gendered labor, so it's women who are responsible for handling bread within the home, but men do play a key role in other ways. So in the rural context, for example, they take primary responsibility for farming wheat, and in urban areas, they're often the ones who go to the bakery and buy bread. Homemade bread is made from just 4 ingredients: flour, water, salt, and yeast. It doesn't have any additional preservatives. And this means that the bread requires careful management if it's to remain edible for the month after it's been baked. Women in the village use 2 preservation techniques, freezing and drying. After baking, they'll cut their bread into quarters and divide it into piles. The first pile they keep for what they call soft bread, aish tari, and some of this bread they'll leave on the tray or in the fridge to eat over the next couple of days. The remainder they freeze. So most people have one of those little freezer compartments in the top of their refrigerator. Freezing stops the bread from becoming moldy, but when it becomes time to eat, a particular kind of care work is required to make these frozen loaves palatable. It's a winter evening just after sunset, and 2 teenage girls in Warda are in the courtyard of their home. The stars are coming out in the clear, dark sky, and there's a chill in the air. The girls are crouched beside a metal bowl full of hot coals. All around the village, you'll see these glows of hot coals outside homes as families get ready for their evening meal. One by one, the women take loaves from their pile beside them and lay them on the flames. They watch the ice crystals disappear as the loaves transform from stiff to flexible. They turn each quarter over once or twice to make sure that the thicker edge of the loaf, as well as the thinner middle part, defrost. They then take the bread off the flames before it changes color. They want to thaw it from its frozen state, not toast it to a crisp. Once they've worked their way through the pile of 20 or so quarters, they wrap the bread in a cloth and bring it through to the table, ready as dinner is served. This is fresh bread. So we don't often consider these kinds of everyday domestic practices alongside things like national import regulations or a government subsidy program. But what I'm trying to show here is these connections. These dynamics are taking place at different scales, and they involve different actors who have different interests, but they're all in their own ways about people working to ensure that there's good bread to eat. The other pile of bread that women often divide off on baking days is for what they call dry bread, aish neshif. This isn't a dryness of staleness, it's a dryness that's specifically produced to prolong the bread's life. Marwa has just finished baking. She examines each loaf as she cuts them into quarters. The thin and soft ones we eat fresh, she says. The rest we dry. She turns down the heat of her gas oven, which she's been using for baking, and starts putting the bread back in the oven. Bismillah, in the name of God, she says, before she puts in each piece. So whereas the girls I just told you about were heating frozen loaves over a hot fire to eat immediately, this Marwa is drying fresh loaves in a warm oven to eat at some point in the future. She carefully moves the quarters around different parts of the oven, taking them out every so often and feeling them, squeezing the thicker parts to see if they have any remaining softness. She balances the loaves upright near the mouth of the oven to dry out their last side. When the bread is finally fully dry, she lays it carefully on a metal dish. Once in this dry state, the bread can last 2 months without any need for wrapping or covering. You can just put it in an open cardboard box like this. When it comes time to eat, some people will eat this bread like it is, a bit like a cracker. Others will moisten the bread just by sprinkling droplets on it or by briefly immersing it in a bowl of water. This doesn't make the bread soft like fresh bread, but it makes it less stiff and more pliable. This is important because when people eat the bread, they typically pull off small pieces and fold them in order to scoop up a sauce or perhaps pick up some salad. As well as these practices of maintaining the quality of homemade bread, women's ways of handling bread within the home are also designed to ensure that none is wasted. At the end of the meal, for example, women will dust off any leftover bread, pat it clean, and place it to the side to serve at the next meal. This is in part because there's a cultural norm against wasting bread, throwing it away, but also because people have an interest in not wasting a staple food that they've invested so much energy in producing. These women don't talk about this household work in terms of security, but their day-to-day acts are just as significant for ensuring that they have their desired staple to eat. They know that without bread, the meals they're presenting to their families, which in many cases may comprise little other than bread, would be insufficient. A bit of fermented cheese, tomato, a few olives are unlikely to fill the belly if they're not accompanied by some bread. And they can't afford rice or pasta, which are the kind of alternative staples, except for once a week. Given that they're eating bread 3 times a day, it's also not surprising that they care about what that bread tastes like. The threat, therefore, isn't so much about there not being any bread to eat, but about there not being good bread to eat. In the case of the extended family that I used to live next to in the village, for example, there's a strong preference for homemade bread, which household members perceive as being better, cleaner, tastier, healthier than purchased bread. So while they can go and get subsidized bread if they run out of homemade bread, so if, for instance, the women don't freeze or dry enough loaves to last until the next baking day, they don't like to do this. I remember once I was sharing a meal with them when the male head of the household complained about the subsidized bread that the women served, sort of angrily ordering them to bake and bake soon. So women's efforts not only to bake homemade bread, but also to maintain its quality and prevent wastage in the home are all about making sure that they have decent bread to put on the table. They're all techniques of securing a staple. To conclude, while on the face of it, a controversy over a fungus in imported grain, a frustrating experience of working through bureaucratic steps to get a new smart card, and the handling of bread within a rural home might appear to have little in common, they're united by a staple food. The reason why ergot is so controversial is because the wheat it's found on is destined for use in subsidized bread, and also because it threatens domestic wheat cultivation that's key for bread production. The reason why the smart card bureaucracy is significant is because it mediates who's able to access cheap bread. The reason why freezing, drying, and saving scraps of bread in homes is notable is because they're fundamental to a family having good bread to eat. Staple security therefore offers a frame through which to analyse these complex dynamics together. At the level of the nation, city, and household, we see these deep anxieties about bread scarcity, the desires for bread quality, and the ongoing efforts to meet these perceived needs. We see the nexus of food and security. And it's within this realm of lived experience, in these everyday practices of staple security, that we see what ultimately shapes Egyptians' access to their daily bread. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jessica, for such a great presentation. That's really informative. As I told you, I'm Egyptian and I did not know most of the things that you presented about today. So that was a really great a great lecture. So let's open the Q&A for those who have questions for Jessica or clarifying questions. You can either put the questions in the chat or raise your hand. Sail up with some instructions in the chat if you would like to ask questions. I think until people start thinking about their questions, I may ask you one. Maybe I know this research and this field work was conducted mostly around 2014, 2013. And I would love to hear your thoughts now with the crushing economic crisis in Egypt right now, not just with the Russia-Ukraine war, but also with the war in Gaza and the poor decisions of Sisi over the past and these mega infrastructure projects. And so how do you see this book and the findings of this book in Sisi's 2024 Egypt?
I mean, I think in some ways it really just illustrates some of the points I'm trying to make in the book, because I think we're seeing in the crushing economic crisis where price has gone up so much in the market for almost every food, we're seeing the importance of this subsidized bread really come into relief, because people really can't afford so many other things. So I think that central significance of bread to people's lives has come into really stark light in these recent years. I think also it's sort of interesting. I think it also sort of speaks to the political significance of the bread, the fact that Sisi's government hasn't really cut back this subsidy very much. I mean, in some small ways that's sort of a bit technical. They have tried to make some cuts, but they haven't really made substantial changes to cut this program. And I think the fact that they haven't done that, whereas they have cut back so many other subsidies, like subsidies on fuel, again, is speaking to the particular political significance around bread. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is really a great point. And I think we can talk more also about other commodities, which now is becoming very strategic, the way that bread that you describe in your book, for instance, like the sugar crisis now in Egypt and how it's really crushing the country. And I would really, especially with Ramadan coming in and this kind of rising need for sugar in Ramadan and after fasting. So I also like thinking about like how, and I'm not, you don't have to answer me now. I'm just gonna open up to the audience. Like I don't want to be like the one taking all the questions, but also like thinking about this other strategic commodities like sugar, for instance, right? And how would you compare that to your findings from that really great book? But I think we have a question here in the chat. I don't know, Jessica, can you see the chat? Or
I'm just trying to, let me try and open it up here. So this question about self-sufficiency.
Yes.
The question regarding those who believe in becoming fully self-sustaining grain production within Egypt, is their land already being prepared for expanding production, or would it require large-scale projects like redirection waterways or something? Yes, there's been this long interest in self-sufficiency, in attaining self-sufficiency in grain. This is not a new thing. In fact, that was one of the things I was most interested that brought me into this project, actually, was some of this interest in this recurring rhetoric that we see back to the 1950s, but then we see it again. President Morsi was talking in terms of trying to become self-sufficient in grain. We see some sort of elements of that. But it didn't end up being a major theme in the book, actually, because most kind of agricultural experts I spoke to said it's not really ever going to be possible to become self-sufficient in grain. So in the past, Egypt was self-sufficient in wheat, but the consumption is so high now that most people said it's just not going to be sort of feasible to imagine that you could ever produce that much grain. So although you sometimes see that rhetoric of self-sufficiency, most people said it's not really a kind of government goal at present. It's not considered by those who are running agricultural policy to be a feasible goal. That said, there is still interest in expanding production, definitely, and the government's doing all sorts of things to try and expand production. And there's not much scope for expanding production on the existing land. As I said, most farmers do already plant wheat and their yields are actually really pretty good. So there's not much scope for expanding on the existing land. But yes, they are interested in expanding into new areas, and it would require, they do all require large infrastructure projects, which often involve diverting water or sometimes tapping deep groundwater. So the CC administration has continued as one of its mega projects these reclamation initiatives that also have a very long history. But I think one of the interesting things has been with these new round of reclamation projects, whereas with some of the earlier ones, a lot of the focus was on, could we develop commercial agriculture in the desert and kind of grow early season strawberries to export to Europe? Whereas now quite a bit of the rhetoric around these reclamation projects is that they're being framed in terms of kind of increasing self-sufficiency or kind of growing more wheat for the country. Yeah.
Thank you, Jessica. I think Nadav has his hands up.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica. So I guess I'm curious what your thoughts are on what makes a staple a staple. So do you see the same things around water, for example, in Egypt, right? Also necessary for survival, also constructed as national security, also in short supply. But you don't hear about water riots, right? Or people complaining about the price of water like you do with the price of bread. And so why? Or is my impression wrong and people do organize collectively around water?
I think there's lots of interesting parallels to think about with water too, like you say, I mean, and in the Egyptian context, specifically, like that concern about the majority of Egypt's water coming from another country. So that concern about when the water supply, the supply isn't within your country. There's also actually some very interesting parallels between some of the discussions that you see around wanting to have grain in silos that are similar to kind of wanting to have water in Lake Nasser, because you want to have some of the resource stored within your borders as a matter of security. So I think there's a lot of interesting parallels. But it's not a sort of direct parallel. I mean, you do in other places often see riots over water. You haven't particularly in Egypt. I mean, you do see conflicts over water. That was a lot what my first book was about, but it's more over irrigation water because that's the main user of water that uses by far the most water in Egypt. You don't see such concerns about the price of water because by and large, water is not priced in Egypt. So it's not got that same sort of sense of the same association with price as the bread does. So I think there are definitely some interesting parallels there, but it's not a kind of, and I actually, sometimes when I'm talking with American audiences, the notion of a staple food doesn't really sort of resonate with them because, there's not necessarily a clear staple in the US for many people in the US. But I think there are some interesting parallels actually if you think about gas prices, gas in the US, like that sense that you need the concerns when gas prices go up at the concerns about reliance on foreign gas, the sense that you need gas for your car. So yeah, I think there are some parallels, but it's not direct.
I also think that it did not hit them yet. So I think now the treaty with Ethiopia and how the treaty was handled and giving the Egyptians hope that there is some area for negotiating was Ethiopia. Although Ethiopia said it's already done, we building and we're filling and we don't care about you. But I think there's always this kind of media kind of picturing the situation as if it's a fluid situation. It's still going on. But I also think that it did not hit Egyptians yet. Like you go to Egypt and you see the Nile is significantly lower than it used to be. But they're still living. They still didn't directly impact their lives yet. So I think it did not hit them enough to start like protesting or doing riots about water issues. But I think the bread as being an everyday living for them and something that they consume every day. And I think I'm seeing more similarities with the sugar crisis in Egypt now. The riots actually, like now, the riots in Egypt because of the sugar. how people think that's like it's unacceptable. Where is the sugar? Like for Egyptians, the sugar and the tobacco, these two things you cannot take them away from Egyptians. So I see more similarities with the sugar situation, and I never imagined that the sugar would cause such a crisis for the government at this point. They got over the crisis with the gas prices. They got over was the issue with the water with the people. Like they went away with a lot of major issues. Like they managed it well, but with the sugar, they're not able to. So yes, I think that's a really interesting question about the staple kind of concept and what is staple instead of a saying. Okay, other questions? Others? Oh, sorry, Jessica, I interrupted you.
Oh, no, the sugar is interesting to think about. I'll have to look at, because there are some similarities and then also some differences in terms of how the system works, but also thinking about, there's a very famous book by Sidney Mintz where he talks about sort of how sugar became a staple and in the kind of during the Industrial Revolution in Britain, even because people became so used to having it in their tea. And anyway, yeah.
As we always joke in Egypt, people have like tea, sugar with tea, not like tea with sugar, right? It's all about like the 5 spoons of sugar in the tea that you have to take every 3-4 times a day. Okay, so do we have any other questions, thoughts, comments for Jessica? Okay, so I think we are good for today, and then we would like to thank you again, Jessica, so much for visiting us, and hopefully next time virtually, and hopefully next time we'll see you in person.
Great, thank you so much for coming.